Hey everyone, tonight we're falling down some of Wikipedia's darkest rabbit holes, starting with the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students transformed into sadistic torturers in just 36 hours. So before we dive into some genuinely unsettling territory, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for this kind of content. And let me know in the comments what Wikipedia article kept you awake at night. Fair warning, some of tonight's rabbit holes get pretty dark, so listener discretion is advised. Now turn off the lights if you dare, and let's explore some of the most disturbing corners of human knowledge together. So here's where this story gets truly disturbing. Within less than 2 days, student volunteers had begun stripping naked prisoners, forcing them into stress positions and making them simulate sexual acts with each other. What's truly terrifying is that these weren't criminals or sociopaths. They were regular Stanford University students who had passed psychological evaluations just days before. In August 1971, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo converted the basement of Stanford's psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 male college students, all deemed psychologically stable and normal after extensive screening. Half were randomly assigned to be guards, half to be prisoners. What happened next defies explanation. The guards were given khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses to prevent eye contact, and wooden batons. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers who had agreed to participate in the experiment. They were blindfolded, handcuffed, and brought to the makeshift prison, where they were stripped, deloused, and given smocks to wear with no underwear underneath. And somehow, this gets even worse. By the second day, the guards had begun waking prisoners at 2:30 a.m. for counts, forced lineups, where prisoners had to recite their ID numbers. When prisoners showed any resistance, punishments escalated rapidly. Guards forced them to do push-ups, often with a guard stepping on the prisoner's back or forcing another prisoner to sit on them. The most disturbing part? The guards weren't following any script. Zimbardo had given them minimal instructions just to maintain order and not use physical violence. Everything else they invented themselves, drawing from some dark well of human nature that nobody knew existed. Guard John Wayne, as he called himself, emerged as particularly sadistic. He developed elaborate punishment rituals, forced prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands, and made them repeat degrading chants. He later admitted he was consciously trying to be as tough as possible, modeling himself after a guard character from the movie Cool Hand Luke. But what investigators found next was even worse. The prisoners weren't just submitting to abuse, they were psychologically breaking down in ways that shocked even Zimbardo. Prisoner hash 8612 began showing signs of acute emotional disturbance on just the second day. He started crying uncontrollably, screaming, and showing symptoms of severe anxiety. When hash 8612 asked to leave, Zimbardo, who had begun thinking of himself as the prison superintendent rather than a researcher, initially refused. He offered the prisoner a deal: become an informant on the other prisoners in exchange for better treatment. The student was so psychologically compromised that he seriously considered it before finally insisting on leaving. Which is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was terminated after just 6 days when Zimbardo's girlfriend, Christina Maslach, visited the prison and was horrified by what she saw. She found Zimbardo watching the guards abuse prisoners through a video monitor, taking notes with scientific detachment, while students were suffering psychological breakdowns just feet away. What's most disturbing is how quickly ordinary people transformed. The guards weren't recruited for aggression. They were college students studying psychology, many of whom considered themselves liberal and opposed to authoritarianism. Yet within hours of putting on a uniform and being given authority, they began systematically dehumanizing their peers. The prisoners, meanwhile, began exhibiting what psychologists call learned helplessness. They stopped resisting even when opportunities arose. Some began taking the guard's side against fellow prisoners. Others developed psychosomatic illnesses, real physical symptoms with no physical cause, their bodies responding to psychological trauma. And to this day, nobody can explain why this transformation happened so quickly and completely. One guard later described feeling like he was in a movie, playing a role that felt increasingly real. He said the sunglasses were crucial. They created a barrier between his normal self and this new, cruel persona. Without being able to make eye contact with prisoners, it became easier to see them as objects rather than people. The experiment revealed something horrifying about human nature, that the line between civilized behavior and barbarism is far thinner than we'd like to believe. These weren't specially selected individuals predisposed to cruelty. They were randomly assigned college students who, when given roles in a power structure, quickly adapted to become either oppressors or victims. But the real horror lies in the details of what actually happened in that basement. Guards created increasingly elaborate humiliation rituals. They forced prisoners to sing songs, tell jokes, and perform exercises designed to exhaust and degrade them. Some guards worked extra shifts voluntarily, either enjoying the power. The psychological mechanisms at work were documented in disturbing detail, and guards began using de-individuation, referring to prisoners only by numbers, never names. They implemented collective punishment, where all prisoners suffered when one broke a rule. They created arbitrary rules and then punished prisoners for infractions that changed daily. Prisoner #416, who entered the experiment late, refused to participate in the degradation rituals. Instead of inspiring other prisoners to resist, his defiance led to increased punishment for everyone. The other prisoners began pressuring him to comply, showing how quickly victim solidarity can break down under systematic oppression. The guards developed what they called the privilege cell, a slightly larger space where compliant prisoners could be housed as a reward. These created competition among prisoners for better treatment. Further breaking down group cohesion, guards would randomly move prisoners between the privilege cell and punishment cells, creating psychological uncertainty and dependence. Sleep deprivation became a central tool of control. Guards deliberately disrupted prisoners' sleep schedules with random counts and cell searches. Prisoners were forced to sleep on concrete floors without blankets as punishment. Some began showing signs of severe sleep deprivation psychosis within just a few days. The food situation revealed another layer of systematic dehumanization. Guards controlled when and how much prisoners could eat. They would force prisoners to eat slowly, quickly, or not at all based on arbitrary decisions. Some prisoners were forced to eat without using their hands, treating them like animals. Physical exercise became psychological torture. Guards would make prisoners do jumping jacks until exhaustion, then criticize their form and make them start over. Push-ups were done with guards standing on prisoners' backs or forcing other prisoners to sit on them. The exercise had no purpose other than to demonstrate complete control over prisoners' bodies. The bathroom situation was particularly degrading. Prisoners had to ask permission for basic biological functions, and guards would often deny requests or grant them with humiliating conditions attached. Some prisoners were forced to defecate in buckets that weren't emptied regularly, creating unsanitary conditions that added to their psychological distress. Zimbardo himself became so absorbed in his role as superintendent that he lost sight of his responsibility as a researcher. He began making decisions based on maintaining prison order rather than gathering scientific data. When prisoners' parents visited, he worried about maintaining the illusion of a real prison rather than their children's psychological well-being. The visiting day itself revealed the depth of the psychological transformation. The parents who came to see their sons were treated like real prison visitors. Searched, made to wait, given limited time with their children. Many parents played along with the charade instead of demanding their sons be released from what was obviously causing them distress. Some prisoners began identifying with their captors, a phenomenon now known as Stockholm Syndrome. They would report on other prisoners' escape plans or rule violations. They began adopting the guards' perspective, criticizing fellow prisoners for causing trouble rather than recognizing the illegitimate nature of their treatment. The escape attempt on day 3 showed both the reality of the psychological control and its artificial nature. When prisoners planned to break out, Zimbardo responded not as a researcher but as a prison administrator. He moved the entire experiment to another floor, worried about real escape rather than simply ending the obviously harmful study. Guard behavior escalated throughout the experiment. What started as following rules became creative punishment, then deliberate psychological torture. Guards began working overtime without pay, suggesting they were deriving satisfaction from the power and control. Some later admitted to sexual fantasies involving the prisoners. The role of bystanders proved equally disturbing. The graduate students, visitors, and other staff members witnessed the abuse but rarely intervened. They became complicit in the system, normalizing behavior that would have shocked them in any other context. The environment itself seemed to make cruelty acceptable. Christina Meslach, who eventually convinced Zimbardo to end the experiment, described feeling like she was in a nightmare. She saw a line of prisoners with bags over their heads, chained together, being led to the bathroom while guards shouted orders. Her immediate reaction was horror, but everyone else in the building treated it as normal. The termination of the experiment came not from ethical concerns about the prisoner's well-being, but from an outsider's perspective, piercing the bubble of normalized cruelty that had developed. Zimbardo had become so immersed in the role-playing that he couldn't see the obvious harm being done. Post-experiment interviews revealed the lasting psychological impact on participants. Some guards felt guilty about their behavior, while others defended it as necessary for maintaining order. Prisoners described ongoing anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting authority figures. The experiment had created real psychological wounds that persisted long after the roles ended. The study raised fundamental questions about the nature of evil and authority. It suggested that ordinary people could commit atrocities not because they were inherently bad, but because they were placed in systems that encouraged and rewarded cruel behavior. The implications for understanding historical atrocities like the Holocaust were profound and disturbing. Years later, some participants described the experiment as one of the most significant experiences of their lives, both positive and negative. Guards talked about learning uncomfortable truths about their capacity for cruelty. Prisoners described developing empathy for real victims of institutional abuse that shaped their later careers and worldview. The research methodology itself became controversial. Critics argued that Zimbardo's dual role as researcher and superintendent created bias and ethical violations. The lack of proper oversight, informed consent procedures, and participant protection became a cautionary tale for psychological research ethics. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how easily the experiment's lessons can be seen in real-world situations. The systematic dehumanization, the role of authority in legitimizing cruelty, the breakdown of individual moral reasoning in group settings. These patterns repeat throughout history in contexts from military training to corporate hierarchies to social media mob behavior. The Stanford prison experiment documented in clinical detail how quickly humans can adapt to roles that require them to cause suffering to others. It showed that evil isn't necessarily the result of evil people, but can emerge from evil systems that ordinary people find themselves part of. The transformation happens so quickly and completely that it suggests these capacities for both cruelty and submission exist just beneath the surface of civilized behavior, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. What makes this even more disturbing is the level of detail we have about exactly how the psychological transformation occurred. Video recordings, audio tapes, and detailed logs documented every stage of the descent from normal college students to a functioning system of oppression and victimization. The first night established the pattern that would define the entire experiment. Guards woke prisoners at midnight for the first count, ostensibly to familiarize them with their numbers. But what started as a simple roll call became an hour-long ordeal of push-ups, jumping jacks, and verbal abuse. The guards discovered they enjoyed having absolute power over another human being. By morning, the psychological roles had already begun to solidify, and guards walked differently, talked differently, and thought differently about the prisoners. They had internalized their authority overnight, and the prisoners had begun to internalize their powerlessness. The transformation was so rapid that it suggests these psychological mechanisms are fundamental to human nature. The second day brought the first serious breakdown. Prisoner hash 8612, a college student named Douglas Corpy, began screaming that he wanted out. But instead of rage, he showed classic signs of learned helplessness, crying, disorganized thinking, and an inability to take action to help himself. In less than 36 hours, he had been psychologically broken. What happened to Doug Corpy revealed the true horror of psychological manipulation. He wasn't physically harmed, but the constant stress, sleep deprivation, and systematic humiliation had triggered what appeared to be an acute psychological crisis. He began talking to himself, refused to eat, and showed signs of severe anxiety and depression. When Corpy demanded to be released, Zimbardo made a crucial error that revealed how deeply he had adopted his role as prison superintendent. Instead of immediately ending the student's participation, he tried to convince Corpy that he was just having a tough time and should stick it out. The welfare of the research participant had become secondary to maintaining the prison simulation. The guards, meanwhile, had developed their own disturbing psychology. They began to see prisoner breakdowns not as signs that the experiment was causing harm, but as proof that they were effectively doing their jobs. Prisoner suffering became validation of guard authority rather than a reason for concern. The sleep deprivation tactics became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. Guards would wake prisoners at random intervals throughout the night, sometimes every hour, for counts that could last 30 minutes or more. They would make prisoners recite rules, sing songs, or perform calisthenics while half asleep and disoriented. The psychological effects of chronic sleep deprivation compounded every other aspect of the prison environment. Prisoners became more compliant, more easily confused, and less able to think clearly about their situation. Their cognitive abilities deteriorated rapidly, making them more vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. Food became another tool of psychological control. Meals were served at irregular times, portions were arbitrary, and guards would interrupt eating for random counts or exercises. Some prisoners were forced to eat with their hands tied behind their backs. Others had their food mixed together into unappetizing slop. The message was clear. Guards controlled every aspect of prisoners' existence, including basic survival needs. The bathroom privileges revealed perhaps the most degrading aspect of the psychological manipulation, that prisoners had to ask permission for basic biological functions, and guards would often deny requests or grant them only after humiliating conditions were met. Some prisoners were forced to urinate in buckets in their cells, creating unsanitary conditions that added to their psychological distress. The physical environment itself became a tool of psychological torture. Cells were deliberately cramped and uncomfortable. Lighting was harsh and constant, preventing normal sleep cycles. Temperature was kept uncomfortable, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold. Every aspect of the physical space was designed to create psychological stress. The introduction of the hole, a tiny dark closet used for solitary confinement, represented the pinnacle of the guards' psychological cruelty. Its prisoners were stuffed into this space for hours at a time, unable to sit or lie down comfortably. The sensory deprivation and physical discomfort caused rapid psychological deterioration. What emerged from detailed analysis of the experiment was a systematic process of dehumanization that followed predictable patterns. First, guards stripped prisoners of individual identity by assigning numbers and identical clothing. Then they established arbitrary rules that created opportunities for punishment. Finally, they escalated punishments until they reached the limits of what they could justify to themselves. The role of the reflective sunglasses proved crucial to the guards' psychological transformation. By preventing eye contact, the sunglasses eliminated one of the most basic forms of human connection. Guards later reported that this made it much easier to see prisoners as objects rather than people. The simple act of hiding their eyes allowed them to suppress their natural empathy. The uniform effect worked both ways. Just as the sunglasses and khaki clothing helped guards adopt aggressive personas, the smocks and chains helped prisoners adopt submissive ones. The clothing wasn't just symbolic, it was a powerful psychological tool that reinforced the power dynamic every moment of every day. The development of prison slang and rituals created an alternate reality that divorced the experiment from normal moral frameworks. Guards developed their own language, their own procedures, and their own justifications for increasingly cruel behavior. They created a culture where brutality was not only acceptable, but expected. The visiting day on the fourth day revealed how completely the participants had internalized their roles. When parents came to see their sons, both guards and prisoners maintained the prison facade. Parents were searched, made to wait, and given limited time with their children. Many parents played along rather than demanding their sons be released from an obviously harmful situation. Some parents actually reinforced the prison dynamic by urging their sons to tough it out and not quit the experiment. They had been co-opted into the system, treating their children's psychological distress as a character-building experience rather than recognizing it as evidence of psychological abuse. The prisoners' responses to visiting day were equally disturbing. Some maintained the facade so completely that they tried to hide their psychological distress from their parents. Others broke down completely, begging to be taken home but unable to take the simple step of refusing to continue participation. The escape plot that developed on the third day showed both the reality of the psychological control and its fundamentally artificial nature. When prisoners began planning to break out, Zimbardo's response revealed how completely he had lost perspective. Instead of recognizing that prisoners planning an escape from a psychological experiment indicated serious problems, he responded as a real prison administrator would. Zimbardo moved the entire experiment to another floor of the building, dismantled and rebuilt the prison, and developed security procedures to prevent the escape. He was so immersed in his role as superintendent that he couldn't see the absurdity of implementing real security measures to prevent college students from leaving a voluntary research study. The conspiracy rumors that Zimbardo spread among the prisoners showed the sophisticated psychological manipulation at work. By convincing prisoners that outsiders were planning to help them escape, he created paranoia and mistrust that further broke down prisoner solidarity. Prisoners began informing on each other, competing for guard approval rather than supporting each other. The role of the prison chaplain, a real minister brought in to add authenticity to the simulation, demonstrated how institutional roles can corrupt even well-meaning people. The chaplain interviewed prisoners about their cases and sentences, reinforcing the illusion that they were real criminals rather than research participants. When prisoners asked the chaplain to help them get out, he advised them to get lawyers rather than simply walking away from a voluntary experiment. He had been so convinced by the simulation that he forgot these were students who could leave at any time. His participation legitimized the entire system in the prisoners' minds. The introduction of a public defender, another real professional brought in for authenticity, further reinforced the prisoner's sense of helplessness. Instead of recognizing that students in a research study shouldn't need legal representation to leave, the lawyer played his role so convincingly that prisoners began to believe they were trapped in the system. The psychological assessment data collected throughout the experiment revealed the rapid deterioration of prisoners' mental health. Standardized tests showed increasing anxiety, depression, and disorganized thinking. Physical health also declined, with prisoners showing symptoms of stress-related illness, including headaches, loss of appetite, and sleep disorders. Most disturbing was the speed of these changes. Measurable psychological deterioration occurred within hours of the experiment beginning. By the third day, some prisoners showed clinical levels of anxiety and depression. The human psyche proved far more fragile and malleable than anyone had expected. The guards' psychological profiles showed equally dramatic changes, but in the opposite direction. They reported feeling increasingly confident, powerful, and satisfied with their performance. Some described the experience as the most important thing they had ever done. They had discovered they enjoyed having absolute power over other human beings. The detailed logs kept by guards revealed the systematic nature of their psychological manipulation. They recorded not just what punishments they imposed, but how prisoners responded. They experimented with different techniques to see what would break prisoner resistance most effectively. It was psychological torture conducted with scientific precision. The emergence of guard hierarchies created additional psychological pressure. Guards competed with each other to be the most effective at controlling prisoners. This led to escalating cruelty as guards tried to outdo each other's creative punishments. The environment rewarded sadistic behavior and punished any sign of sympathy for prisoners. The night shift guards developed particularly brutal techniques, taking advantage of reduced supervision to engage in more extreme psychological manipulation. And they would force prisoners to perform degrading acts, engage in elaborate punishment rituals, and create fear through unpredictable behavior. The darkness seemed to unleash even darker impulses. The role of the graduate student assistants who helped run the experiment demonstrated how institutional authority can corrupt judgment. These advanced psychology students witnessed clear evidence of psychological harm, but rationalized it as necessary for the research. They became complicit in abuse by treating it as scientific data collection. The video recordings made during the experiment captured behaviors that shocked viewers decades later. Guards could be seen laughing while prisoners suffered, showing genuine enjoyment of their power. Prisoners could be seen regressing to childlike behavior, crying for their mothers, and showing signs of psychological breakdown. The audio recordings revealed even more disturbing details. Guards could be heard discussing ways to make prisoners' lives more miserable. Prisoners could be heard begging for mercy, agreeing to increasingly degrading demands just to avoid worse punishment. The tapes documented the systematic destruction of human dignity. The experiment's end came suddenly when Christina Maslach, Zimbardo's girlfriend and fellow psychologist, visited the mock prison. Her fresh perspective allowed her to see what everyone involved had normalized. She was horrified by what she witnessed and demanded that Zimbardo end the experiment immediately. Maslach later described feeling like she had walked into a surreal nightmare. She saw a line of prisoners with bags over their heads, chained together, being led to the bathroom while guards shouted orders. Her immediate revulsion contrasted sharply with the matter-of-fact way everyone else in the building treated the scene. The debriefing sessions held after the experiment revealed the lasting psychological impact on participants. Guards struggled with guilt about their behavior, but also admitted to missing the power they had wielded. Some said it was the most intense experience of their lives. The taste of absolute authority had been intoxicating. Prisoners reported ongoing anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting authority figures. Some developed lasting phobias related to confined spaces or uniformed authority. The experiment had created real psychological trauma that persisted long after the artificial roles ended. The follow-up studies conducted years later revealed that the psychological impact of the experiment had shaped participants' life choices. Many guards went into careers where they could exercise authority over others. Many prisoners became advocates for prison reform or entered helping professions. The 6 days had permanently altered their understanding of human nature. The ethical implications of the experiment became a watershed moment for psychology research. New guidelines were developed requiring informed consent, participant protection, and independent oversight of research involving human subjects. The Stanford prison experiment became a cautionary tale about the responsibility of researchers to protect participants from harm. But the most disturbing aspect of the Stanford prison experiment isn't what it revealed about psychology research. It's what it revealed about human nature itself. The speed and completeness of the transformation from ordinary college students to a functioning system of oppression suggests that these capacities exist within all of us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The experiment showed that evil isn't necessarily the result of evil people, but can emerge from evil systems that ordinary people find themselves part of. The implications for understanding historical atrocities, current injustices, and the potential for future horrors are as relevant today as they were in 1971. The dark truth is that under the right circumstances, any of us might discover we're capable of becoming either the oppressor or the victim, and we might adapt to either role far more quickly than we'd ever want to believe. The specific psychological mechanisms documented in the Stanford basement have been identified in countless real-world situations since 1971. Military training programs deliberately use similar techniques to break down individual identity and rebuild soldiers who will follow orders without question. The systematic dehumanization, sleep deprivation, arbitrary punishment, and group pressure documented at Stanford became a blueprint for understanding how ordinary people are transformed into instruments of institutional violence. Corporate environments often replicate these power dynamics in subtler but equally damaging ways. Employees learn to suppress their individual moral judgment in favor of organizational goals. They develop loyalty to systems that may cause harm to others, rationalizing their participation through the same psychological mechanisms that turned Stanford students into cruel guards or helpless prisoners. The experiment's influence on understanding torture and interrogation techniques is particularly disturbing. The psychological manipulation tactics discovered accidentally at Stanford were later systematically employed by intelligence agencies and military organizations. The revelation that ordinary college students could be broken down so completely provided a roadmap for professional interrogators seeking to extract information or confessions from prisoners. Military psychologists studied the Stanford prison experiment extensively, not to prevent such abuses, but to understand how to create them more effectively. The techniques of environmental manipulation, sleep deprivation, social isolation, and arbitrary punishment became standard tools in enhanced interrogation programs. What began as an academic study of prison psychology became a handbook for systematic psychological torture. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq showed Stanford's lessons being applied on a global scale. American soldiers, many of them reservists with no military training in prison management, spontaneously developed the same abusive techniques that Stanford guards had invented. The photographs from Abu Ghraib could have been taken in Zimbardo's basement, Burjas forced into stress positions, sexually humiliated, psychologically broken by systematic dehumanization. When Zimbardo testified as an expert witness in the Abu Ghraib court proceedings, he argued that the soldiers were not individually evil, but had been placed in a system that encouraged and rewarded abusive behavior. The institutional failures, lack of oversight, extreme stress, and dehumanization of prisoners had recreated the conditions of the Stanford prison experiment on a massive scale. The parallels between Stanford and Abu Ghraib were so precise that they seemed to prove the universality of the psychological mechanisms involved. Different cultures, different contexts, different stakes, but the same rapid transformation from ordinary people into agents of systematic cruelty. The guards at Abu Ghraib, like the guards at Stanford, began taking photographs to document their power over helpless victims. The role of photography in both situations revealed another disturbing aspect of institutionalized cruelty. The guards didn't just abuse prisoners, and they celebrated their abuse, creating permanent records of their victims' humiliation. The cameras weren't just documenting evidence of crimes. They were tools of psychological torture, adding an extra layer of dehumanization by treating prisoner suffering as entertainment. But the Stanford prison experiment's influence extends far beyond military and prison contexts. Educational institutions regularly employ similar psychological techniques to maintain discipline and control. Students learn to suppress individual judgment in favor of institutional authority. They develop learned helplessness when faced with arbitrary rules and punishments. The same psychological mechanisms that created compliance in Stanford's mock prison operate in schools, universities, and other educational settings. Workplace harassment and bullying often follow the Stanford pattern precisely. Employees are systematically isolated, subjected to arbitrary criticism, and denied basic dignities until they either submit completely or suffer psychological breakdown. The institutional hierarchy provides legitimacy for abuse, just as the guard uniforms did at Stanford. Bystanders rationalize their inaction by treating workplace cruelty as normal organizational behavior. The experiment's lessons about bystander behavior proved particularly prophetic. The graduate students, visitors, and staff members who witnessed abuse but failed to intervene demonstrated how institutional environments can corrupt even well-meaning people. They saw obvious signs of psychological harm but rationalized their inaction by deferring to authority and maintaining institutional loyalty. This bystander effect has been documented in countless institutional abuse scandals since Stanford. Teachers who witness colleague misconduct, employees who see workplace harassment, citizens who observe police brutality, these all demonstrate the same tendency to normalize obvious wrongdoing when it occurs within legitimate institutional frameworks. The system itself provides psychological cover for individual moral failure. The Stanford prison experiment also revealed how quickly victims can be turned against each other. The competition for privileges, the pressure to inform on fellow prisoners, the psychological rewards for collaboration with authority. These techniques have been employed by oppressive systems throughout history. The experiment showed how victim solidarity can be systematically destroyed, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable to manipulation. Modern social media environments often recreate these dynamics digitally. Online harassment campaigns use systematic dehumanization, arbitrary punishment, and crowd psychology to break down individual resistance. Victims are isolated from support networks, subjected to constant criticism, and offered the choice between submission and escalating abuse. The anonymity and distance of digital interaction eliminate empathy just as effectively as the reflective sunglasses did at Stanford. The algorithmic nature of social media platforms amplifies these effects by creating echo chambers where abusive behavior is normalized and rewarded. Users learn to compete for attention and approval by participating in pile-on harassment, just as Stanford guards competed to be the most effective at controlling prisoners. The psychological mechanisms are identical, but the scale is global and the effects can be permanent. The experiment's documentation of rapid psychological transformation challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and individual responsibility. If ordinary, psychologically healthy college students can become either torturers or victims within hours of being placed in the right environment, what does this mean for our understanding of moral behavior and criminal justice? The implications for legal systems are profound and disturbing. If people's behavior is so dramatically influenced by situational factors, how can we hold individuals accountable for actions that may be primarily the result of environmental pressures? The Stanford prison experiment suggests that focusing on individual guilt and innocence may miss the larger systemic factors that create conditions for abuse. This situational understanding of behavior has been used to argue for leniency in cases involving institutional abuse, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about prevention. If these psychological mechanisms are universal and predictable, why haven't we developed better systems to prevent their activation? The answer may be that those in power benefit from maintaining systems that can quickly transform ordinary people into compliant agents of institutional will. The business applications of Stanford's lessons have been extensively studied and implemented. The management consultants teach techniques for breaking down employee resistance to organizational change using methods directly derived from the prison experiment. The systematic isolation of dissenting voices, the use of arbitrary rewards and punishments, the creation of artificial scarcity and competition, these are now standard tools of corporate management. Employee training programs often employ psychological manipulation techniques that mirror those used at Stanford. New hires are subjected to intensive indoctrination designed to break down individual identity and rebuild loyalty to corporate values. The uniform requirements, strict behavioral codes, and punishment systems used in many workplaces create the same psychological pressures that transformed Stanford students into guards and prisoners. The experiment's revelation of how quickly institutional roles can override individual personality has been applied to understanding leadership development and organizational behavior. Companies now deliberately create high-pressure environments designed to identify employees who will enthusiastically embrace authoritarian roles. The ability to exercise power over others without empathy or moral constraint has become a valued corporate skill. Sales training programs explicitly teach dehumanization techniques for overcoming customer resistance. Salespeople learn to view potential customers as objects to be manipulated rather than people deserving respect. The systematic suppression of empathy that allowed Stanford guards to abuse prisoners is now taught as a professional skill in countless business contexts. The Stanford prison experiment's influence on parenting and child discipline has been equally profound and disturbing. Authoritarian parenting techniques often employ the same psychological manipulation tactics that proved so effective in the Stanford basement. Children are systematically stripped of individual identity, subjected to arbitrary rules and punishments, and taught to suppress their own judgment in favor of parental authority. Educational institutions have implemented discipline systems that mirror the Stanford experiment's most effective control techniques. Students are assigned numbers or identification codes, required to wear uniforms, subjected to arbitrary rules, and punished collectively for individual infractions. The systematic dehumanization that transformed college students into compliant prisoners is now standard practice in many schools. The experiment's documentation of how environmental factors can override individual personality has been used to justify increasingly harsh disciplinary measures in schools and juvenile justice systems. The argument that situational factors are more important than individual character has been twisted to support the creation of more oppressive institutional environments rather than more humane ones. Zero-tolerance policies in schools directly implement the arbitrary punishment systems that proved so effective at Stanford. Students learn that institutional authority is absolute and that resistance will be met with escalating consequences. The psychological mechanisms that created learned helplessness in Stanford prisoners are now deliberately employed to create compliant students who won't challenge institutional authority. The Stanford prison experiment's lessons about the corruption of authority have proven prophetic in countless institutional scandals since 1971. Police departments, religious organizations, athletic programs, healthcare systems, all have demonstrated the same patterns of abuse that emerged in the Stanford basement. Ordinary people given authority over others, placed in environments with minimal oversight, and surrounded by institutional cultures that normalize abuse inevitably recreate the same dynamics. The systematic nature of these patterns suggests that the Stanford prison experiment didn't just document an isolated incident of psychological manipulation. It revealed fundamental truths about how institutional power operates in human societies. The speed and completeness of the transformation from ordinary college students to a functioning system of oppression indicates that these psychological mechanisms are built into the basic architecture of human social behavior. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the experiment's lessons have been used not to prevent institutional abuse, but to make it more effective. The psychological techniques discovered accidentally at Stanford have been systematically refined and implemented by organizations seeking to maintain control over large populations. What began as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority became a handbook for exercising that authority more efficiently. The Stanford prison experiment continues to haunt our understanding of human nature because it revealed capacities within ordinary people that we prefer not to acknowledge. The transformation of college students into torturers and victims wasn't the result of extraordinary circumstances or unusual individuals. It was the predictable outcome of placing normal people in a system designed to reward cruelty and punish empathy. The experiment's enduring relevance lies not just in what it revealed about psychology, but in what it predicted about the future of human society. As institutions become larger, more complex, and more removed from individual accountability, the conditions that created the Stanford prison experiment become increasingly common. The psychological mechanisms that transform students into guards and prisoners continue to operate in corporate boardrooms, government agencies, military units, and educational institutions around the world. The dark truth that emerges from the Stanford prison experiment is that the capacity for both cruelty and submission exists within all of us, waiting for the right institutional framework to bring it to the surface. The experiment didn't create evil, it simply provided the conditions for evil that already existed to manifest and flourish. Understanding this reality is the first step toward creating systems that bring out the best in human nature rather than the worst. But the question remains whether those in power have any incentive to build such systems when the current ones serve their interests so effectively.